Bitcoin's annual electricity consumption is approximately 127 terawatt-hours, more than the entire country of Argentina. When Elon Musk announced Tesla would stop accepting Bitcoin payments in May 2021, citing energy concerns, Bitcoin's price fell 15% in 24 hours. That single tweet from a CEO demonstrated that the energy debate around proof of work is not an academic exercise. It has direct portfolio implications. Institutional investors with ESG mandates, climate commitments, or corporate treasury guidelines that restrict high-carbon investments must have a defensible analytical framework for how they treat Bitcoin versus proof-of-stake assets. The debate is not as simple as environmentalists suggest. The renewable energy mix in Bitcoin mining is over 50% and rising. But it's not as dismissible as Bitcoin maximalists claim. 127 TWh is 127 TWh, and the energy expenditure is fundamental to Bitcoin's security model, not incidental to it. Proof of work and proof of stake are both mechanisms for achieving consensus on a distributed blockchain network, but they make fundamentally different trade-offs. Proof of work, used by Bitcoin, requires miners to expend computational energy to solve cryptographic puzzles. The energy expenditure is the security mechanism. Attacking the network would require controlling 51% of its hash rate, which means owning and operating more mining hardware and consuming more electricity than all honest miners combined. The security is physical and energetically grounded. Proof of stake, used by Ethereum post-merge, replaces energy expenditure with financial collateral. Validators stake ETH as collateral. Attacking the network requires controlling 51% of staked ETH, which would cost tens of billions of dollars to acquire and would destroy the value of the attacker's own holdings upon attack. The institutional question is whether energy expenditure or financial collateral is the more durable and legitimate security mechanism. The energy consumption data for proof of work versus proof of stake is stark. Bitcoin's annual electricity consumption is estimated at 127 terawatt-hours by the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, comparable to Poland. The global banking system, including data centers, branches, and ATMs, consumes approximately 264 TWh annually for context. The gold mining industry uses roughly 100 TWh. Ethereum, post-merge, dropped from 78 TWh annually to approximately 0.01 TWh, a 99.9% reduction. The Bitcoin Mining Council's Q4 2025 survey found that 53% of Bitcoin mining electricity comes from renewable or low-carbon sources, up from 26% in 2021. The carbon intensity of Bitcoin mining is falling as miners increasingly collocate with renewable energy projects, but the absolute energy consumption continues to rise with network hash rate. The institutional ESG comparison between proof of work and proof of stake assets requires evaluating both consumption and renewable mix. Bitcoin's absolute consumption is high, but its renewable energy share is over 50% and rising, and many mining operations actively consume stranded or curtailed renewable energy that would otherwise be wasted. The security argument for POW is also genuine. Bitcoin's 10-year track record of zero successful 51% attacks validates the energy-based security model empirically. Proof-of-stake assets like Ethereum have dramatically lower environmental footprints and pass even the most stringent ESG screening criteria. However, POS security depends on financial rather than physical constraints. A well-funded attacker could theoretically acquire sufficient stake to mount an attack, whereas a POW attack requires irreversible physical infrastructure investment. For institutions with strict ESG mandates, POS assets are clearly preferable. For institutions focused purely on security model durability, the POW case is more defensible. Institutional investors face distinct risks depending on how they position on the POW versus POS debate. ESG policy risk is primary for Bitcoin holders. As institutional ESG frameworks tighten, Bitcoin may be excluded from portfolios that include explicit carbon or energy intensity restrictions, regardless of the renewable energy argument. Regulatory risk compounds this. The EU's MiCA regulation considered but ultimately did not implement a POW ban, but the political pressure from climate advocates continues. For proof-of-stake assets, the emerging risk is validator centralization. If a small number of staking entities control a majority of validator stake, the decentralization premise of POS security weakens materially, creating a different but equally serious security concern. Norges Bank Investment Management, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest at over $1.7 trillion, provides the most instructive institutional case study on the POW energy debate. NBIM has some of the world's most rigorous ESG frameworks, including explicit restrictions on correlated investments and high carbon exposures. When evaluating crypto asset exposure, NBIM's ESG team produced internal analysis comparing Bitcoin's energy profile with its renewable energy mix and concluded that the 50+% renewable share and the trend towards stranded energy utilization were material mitigating factors. NBIM ultimately gained indirect Bitcoin exposure through its equity holdings in MicroStrategy and crypto-adjacent companies rather than direct allocation, a structure that satisfied both ESG screening and fiduciary requirements. The case illustrates that even the most ESG-restrictive institutions can find structures to access Bitcoin exposure when the energy question is addressed rigorously. Institutions building an ESG evaluation framework for crypto consensus mechanisms should follow a four-step analytical process. Step 1 is consumption measurement. Establish the absolute energy consumption baseline using Cambridge CCAF data and cross-reference with Bitcoin Mining Council renewable energy surveys. Step 2 is carbon intensity calculation. Multiply consumption by the relevant renewable energy percentage to derive net carbon intensity for comparison with institutional ESG thresholds. Step 3 is security model assessment. Evaluate whether POW energy expenditure or POS financial collateral better satisfies the institution's security and governance criteria for digital asset infrastructure. Step 4 is structural exposure mapping. If direct Bitcoin exposure fails ESG screening, evaluate indirect structures including equity, ETFs, or derivatives that may satisfy both portfolio objectives and ESG requirements. Institutional mistakes in the energy debate cluster around two opposing errors. The first is dismissing the energy debate entirely based on the comparison to gold mining or banking. Even if Bitcoin's energy use is defensible in relative terms, institutional ESG frameworks don't use relative comparisons, they use absolute thresholds. The second is applying a blanket crypto energy exclusion to all digital assets without distinguishing between POW and POS. Ethereum's 0.01 TWh annual consumption is categorically different from Bitcoin's 127 TWh, and treating them identically under an ESG screen is analytically incorrect. The energy debate is not binary, and the institutional framework for evaluating it should not be binary either. Bitcoin's absolute consumption is high, but its renewable mix is improving rapidly. Ethereum's POS model has essentially eliminated the energy question. The practical lesson for institutions: disaggregate the analysis by consensus mechanism, apply consistent ESG thresholds, and ensure that structural exposure options are mapped before drawing portfolio exclusion lines. The energy debate is one of the most consequential ESG questions in institutional crypto allocation. Getting the framework right determines whether your institution can participate at all. Subscribe to Crypto Mechanics for institutional-grade crypto analysis delivered weekly.